The story of the Black Death begins not in the bustling cities of Europe, but thousands of miles away, in the heart of Central Asia. It was here, along the ancient arteries of trade, that a silent killer began its journey westward. Long before the first European ports were struck with disease, an invisible chain of events had already been set in motion. This was a time when the world was growing more connected. Merchants, caravans, and ships linked distant lands together, carrying silk, spices, jewels, and something far more deadly. Historians believe that the plague originated somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, possibly near modern-day Mongolia. There, in the wild plains, a microscopic bacterium known as Yersinia pestis found its first host among wild rodent populations. Fleas feeding on these animals became infected, and when food sources became scarce, they turned to new hosts, rats that often lived near human settlements. These rats, unlike their wild cousins, traveled. They followed caravans, crept aboard ships, and thrived in the growing hubs of trade. As the 14th century unfolded, the Silk Road flourished. Merchants crossed deserts and mountains, moving goods between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But this network also became the highway of death. Each trade stop was an opportunity for infected rats to jump from one caravan to the next. Each night in crowded inns, stables, and ships, fleas moved from animal to animal, quietly spreading the deadly bacteria. People carried on with their lives, unaware that the invisible enemy was already among them. By the 1330s, records from China and parts of the Middle East spoke of unusual outbreaks, mass deaths, unexplained fevers, and entire communities vanishing. In some regions, the population was already being decimated. Though news traveled slowly, whispers of a strange sickness reached travelers and merchants heading west. But in a time when science was limited and disease was often seen as divine punishment, few understood the nature of what was coming. Then came 1347, the year Europe would never forget. At the edge of the Black Sea lay the port city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Crimea, a bustling trade hub controlled by Italian merchants. It was here that the plague made its dramatic and horrifying entrance into recorded European history. According to chroniclers, the Mongol army laid siege to Kaffa, but during the siege, their ranks were struck by the mysterious illness. In an early act of biological warfare, it is said the Mongols catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, spreading the disease inside. The terrified inhabitants of Kaffa fled by sea, boarding Genoese merchant ships bound for Italy. Unbeknownst to them, they carried more than their belongings and fears. In the dark corners of the ships, rats scurried and fleas thrived, all carrying Yersinia pestis. As the ships sailed across the Mediterranean, the disease sailed with them. In October 1347, the Genoese ships arrived in Messina, Sicily. The townspeople rushed to greet the returning sailors. But what they found was beyond comprehension. Chroniclers described the scene vividly. Sailors lay dead or dying, covered in black swellings and racked with fever. Some ships drifted into harbor, with almost no living crew left. The authorities, horrified, ordered the ships to leave, but it was too late. The disease had already found its foothold on European soil. From Messina, the plague spread like wildfire. The bustling ports of Italy, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, became the next victims, their trade connections ensuring the disease's rapid distribution throughout the continent. Every arrival of a merchant vessel meant potential death. Rats poured off ships and into warehouses, streets, and homes. Fleas jumped to new hosts. The plague followed the lifeblood of medieval Europe, trade. What made the arrival so mysterious and terrifying was the speed and invisibility of the disease's spread. People could not understand how entire towns were suddenly falling ill without any visible cause. Medieval Europe had no concept of bacteria or fleas as disease carriers. They believed bad air, miasma, carried the illness. Some thought it was spread through divine wrath, while others blamed astrological alignments or even poisoning by outsiders. But while they argued over causes, the plague continued its deadly march. By early 1348, the disease reached Marseilles and Paris, then spread north to England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Scandinavia. Everywhere it went, it followed the same pattern. Ships arrived, rats escaped, fleas bit, and communities began to die. Cities that had been bustling centers of culture, trade, and religion suddenly found themselves in the grip of something they couldn't fight or flee from. No army could stop it. No king could command it. The plague moved faster than human understanding. The mysterious arrival of the Black Death was not a single event but a chain reaction, set off years earlier in distant lands, carried forward by commerce, conquest, and human connection. In a tragic irony, the very networks that made the medieval world richer also made it vulnerable. Ports that once represented opportunity became gateways of doom. Trade routes that connected civilizations became arteries of death. Chroniclers of the time struggled to describe what they witnessed. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence, spoke of people collapsing in the streets, families abandoning each other, and death carts moving day and night. In England, records show the disease arrived in June 1348 at the port of Melcombe Regis, carried by a ship from Gascony. Within months, it spread across the country, reaching London by the end of the year. In Norway, the plague reached through a single infected ship, drifting into port with no crew left alive. A ghost ship carrying death. This mysterious arrival was terrifying because it was both natural and unseen. It did not storm through Europe like a conquering army with banners and soldiers. It crept in silently through rat-infested ships, hidden in the daily rhythms of trade and travel. By the time people noticed its presence, it was already too late. The arrival of the Black Death in 1347 marked the beginning of one of the most devastating pandemics in recorded history. Within a few short years, it would decimate populations, alter economies, shake faith, and change the trajectory of Europe forever. But it all began with that quiet, almost unnoticed moment when the ships docked. The rats ran ashore, and an invisible killer entered the continent. The Black Death was not a war of men, but of creatures too small to see clearly and too common to fear. It wasn't launched by kings or soldiers. It was carried into the heart of medieval Europe by two of the most ordinary living things imaginable, rats and fleas. They were the silent carriers of death, weaving through the fabric of daily life unnoticed, until it was far too late. In the 14th century, European cities were overcrowded, dirty, and poorly managed. Streets were narrow and often flooded with refuse. Food scraps, animal waste, and human sewage accumulated in alleys and marketplaces. This created a perfect environment for black rats, ratus, small and agile creatures that thrived in human settlements. Unlike their larger brown cousins, which would arrive in Europe centuries later, black rats preferred to live close to humans, in attics, cellars, warehouses, and aboard ships. They climbed ropes, ran across beams, and nested in the walls of homes and granaries. Wherever there were humans, rats were never far behind. They were uninvited guests, but they blended into the landscape of medieval life so seamlessly that people barely noticed them. They stole grain, gnawed wood, and rustled in the dark. Few realized that each rat might be carrying a passenger far deadlier than its sharp little teeth. The flea, the true engine of the plague, was a small insect, the oriental rat flea, Xenocilichiopes. These fleas lived by feeding on the blood of rats. When an infected rat died, the flea didn't die with it. Instead, it sought a new host. Sometimes it found another rat, but just as easily, it could bite a human. And when it did, it transferred Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes a plague. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria multiplied rapidly, forming a blockage that prevented the flea from swallowing properly. Starving but unable to eat, the flea grew frantic, biting again and again. With each bite, it regurgitated the bacteria into the bloodstream of its victim. This made the flea not just a carrier, but a biological syringe of infection, spreading the plague with terrifying efficiency. Ships became floating ecosystems of plague transmission. In the dark holes where food and cargo were stored, rats nested and multiplied. Fleas hopped from rat to rat, feeding and infecting. Maritime travel in the 14th century was slow. Ships spent weeks or months at sea. During that time, infected rats could die and fleas could move to new hosts. By the time a ship reached its destination, the disease was already well established among the rodent population on board. As soon as the gangplank was lowered, rats scurried into the port city, and fleas leapt into their new environment. These silent carriers were everywhere. They didn't announce themselves like enemy armies. No trumpets or war drums marked their arrival. Instead, they crept through cracks, slipped through cellars, and nested beneath floors. In marketplaces, rats feasted on discarded bread and vegetables. In churches, they ran along rafters unnoticed during Mass. In homes, they shared space with families, sleeping in walls or beneath hay. Fleas hid in fur, clothing, and bedding, waiting for the warmth of a human body to feed on. The terrifying part was how deeply integrated these carriers were into medieval life. People accepted rats as part of the urban environment. Fleas were common irritations. Almost everyone had experienced flea bites, especially in warmer months. There was nothing about these creatures to indicate that they were about to usher in one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. No one in the 14th century understood the role of rats and fleas. Germ theory was centuries away. People believed diseases spread through miasma or bad air. Some thought the plague came from poisoned wells, corrupted spirits, or planetary alignments. They burned incense, carried flowers, or fled cities entirely, all without addressing the real source of the infection that lived right under their noses. In cities like Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Marseille, rats flourished in a labyrinth of wooden structures and warehouses. They followed the food, the waste, and the warmth. Fleas thrived in the same conditions. Once plague entered the rat population of a city, it spread like fire in dry grass. A single infected rat could pass the disease to dozens of fleas. Each flea could infect multiple rats or humans. When infected rats died in large numbers, fleas turned their hunger toward people. The symptoms in rats were as lethal as in humans. Rats would sicken quickly, become sluggish, and die en masse. Contemporary observers sometimes reported sudden rat die-offs in cities or ports shortly before outbreaks began in humans. These were early warning signs, but no one understood their significance. The sudden absence of rats actually made things worse, because starving fleas then sought new warm-blooded hosts, humans, inside crowded medieval homes, where multiple families might live in a single building. Fleas could move rapidly from person to person. Beds stuffed with straw, woolen garments, and thick cloaks offered ideal hiding places. Once fleas entered human spaces, the plague spread with explosive speed. People might not notice a bite at all, but within days, they would develop fever, chills, and swollen buboes, often leading to death in under a week. Even rural areas were not safe. Grain storage attracted rats to farms and villages. Fleas clung to travelers, merchants, and animals, allowing the plague to reach even isolated communities. A single infected rat hiding in a wagon or ship could seed an outbreak hundreds of miles away. The resilience of rats and fleas made them perfect vectors for a pandemic. Rats could survive on little, reproduce quickly, and thrive alongside humans. Fleas could endure periods without feeding and patiently wait for the next host. Together, they created a deadly, self-sustaining network of transmission that required no deliberate human action to spread. Unlike a battlefield, where death is a visible cause, this battlefield was invisible, fought in attics, cellars, and beneath floorboards. In monasteries, castles, and merchant houses alike, no one was immune. Wealth could not keep rats out, nor could piety keep fleas away. From bustling urban centers to quiet countryside villages, rats and fleas crossed every boundary. They didn't respect walls, status, or religion. Their quiet movements erased borders and spread disease without discrimination. As ships continued to arrive from one infected port to the next, rats and fleas acted like a shadow network, moving ahead of human awareness. By the time city officials recognized that an outbreak had begun, the carriers had already moved on, downriver, across the sea, or inland along trade routes. Efforts to isolate the sick or cleanse the air could not touch the true source of the contagion. In this way, rats and fleas became unseen conquerors. Their presence went unquestioned, their danger unrecognized. And as they spread from one harbor to another, they laid the groundwork for a catastrophe that would kill tens of millions. The medieval world, with all its superstitions and limited understanding, never realized that some of the most ordinary creatures in their environment were silently shaping the fate of an entire continent. When the Black Death swept across Europe, it didn't merely claim lives, it dismantled entire populations, reshaped demographics, and carved a wound into human history so deep that its scars can still be traced centuries later. To understand the full magnitude of this disaster, one must look beyond the numbers and glimpse the sheer scale of human loss that unfolded between 1347 and 1351. Before the plague's arrival, Europe was home to an estimated 75 to 80 million people. It was a continent alive with bustling cities, thriving trade routes, and growing rural communities. But within just a few short years, this population was slashed dramatically. Historians estimate that between 25 and 50 million people died, roughly one-third of Europe's population. In some regions, mortality rates were even higher, reaching as much as 60% to 70% of local populations. Death came swiftly and without warning. One year a city might be thriving, and the next, its streets were lined with bodies. Entire villages disappeared from maps, abandoned or wiped out completely. The plague didn't discriminate. Peasants, merchants, priests, nobles, and children were all vulnerable. Its progress was relentless, cutting across kingdoms, languages, and social boundaries with terrifying ease. In Florence, contemporary accounts speak of a city transformed into a graveyard. Chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Houses were emptied, businesses closed, and families collapsed. The city's population fell from approximately 120,000 to around 50,000 in just a few years. Florence was not unique. Venice lost more than 60% of its population. Paris, the beating heart of medieval France, saw tens of thousands perish. In London, around 40,000 people died out of a population of 80,000. Half the city gone. The numbers tell a grim story, but the daily reality of death was even more horrific. As the plague swept through a town, corpses accumulated faster than they could be buried. Graveyards overflowed, forcing communities to dig mass graves, sometimes burying hundreds at a time. Bells tolled endlessly, signaling the passing of yet another soul, until even the bell ringers themselves succumbed to the disease. In some places, there were not enough living left to bury the dead, and bodies were left in homes, on streets, or piled in open pits. Contemporary observers struggled to put into words what they were witnessing. In some chronicles, there is a cold, factual record of numbers. In others, there is sheer disbelief. One chronicler from Siena, Italy, wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. The speed of death contributed to the overwhelming scale. Infected individuals often died within 3 to 5 days, sometimes sooner. This meant that entire households could perish in a single week. One infected traveler arriving in a village could trigger a chain reaction of deaths that spread like wildfire through families and neighbors. Rural areas were hit just as hard as cities. Contrary to the belief that the countryside was safer, the plague reached farms through traders, travelers, and fleeing townspeople. Many villages lost so many inhabitants that they were simply abandoned. Archaeological surveys across Europe have uncovered the remains of lost villages, places that disappeared during the plague years and were never resettled. In some parts of England, up to 40% of villages were deserted. Fields lay untended, livestock wandered freely, and once vibrant rural communities became silent landscapes of decay. Certain regions were struck with such intensity that they experienced population collapse on an unprecedented scale. In Norway, for example, the plague killed at least half the population, and some estimates suggest it may have reached 60% mortality. The disease arrived on a ship drifting into Bergen Harbor with a dead crew, a ghost ship carrying infection. Within months, Norwegian society was shattered. Similar scenes played out in Ireland, Spain, Germany, and Eastern Europe, each with their own stories of devastation. Religious institutions were overwhelmed. Monasteries and convents, where people lived in close quarters, suffered catastrophic losses. In some monasteries, entire communities of monks died, leaving buildings empty and collapsing over time. Parish priests were often the first to respond to the sick, administering last rites, which made them especially vulnerable. In many towns, clergy mortality rates reached 40 to 50%, depriving communities of spiritual and social leadership at their darkest hour. The sheer visibility of death made the plague unlike any previous disaster. Wars and famines, though deadly, were often limited to regions or lasted over longer periods. The Black Death struck everywhere, almost simultaneously, and killed so rapidly that people had little time to react. Chroniclers describe carts piled high with corpses moving through city streets, funeral processions replaced by silent lines of dead bodies. In some towns, plague victims were simply thrown into pits without ceremony. The dignity of burial collapsed under the weight of death. Even the most powerful were not spared. Kings, queens, and nobles fell alongside commoners. In 1348, Queen Joanna of Naples fled the province to escape the plague, but others were less fortunate. Nobles barricaded themselves in castles, attempting to isolate from the contagion, but fleas and rats traveled silently, breaching even the grandest walls. The plague erased distinctions between rich and poor in the most brutal way imaginable. Death was universal. The mortality rates were staggering not only in human terms, but also statistically. In England, population records indicate that between 1348 and 1350, the country lost around 1.5 to 2 million people out of a population of about 4 million. France likely lost between 8 and 10 million. Across the Iberian Peninsula, around half the population perished. In the Holy Roman Empire, mortality was uneven but often catastrophic in urban centers. The psychological impact of such widespread death was profound. Communities became numb to loss. People grew accustomed to seeing death every day. Neighbors, family members, and strangers alike. Some turned to religious fervor, believing the plague was divine punishment. Others embraced fatalism, living recklessly as if tomorrow would never come. Fear of contamination caused families to abandon one another, leaving the sick to die alone. This breakdown of social bonds only intensified the horror. Mortality rates varied, but no region was untouched. Even areas that initially escaped were eventually reached through trade or migration. The plague didn't just sweep once. It came in waves, returning in subsequent years, and continuing to claim lives long after the initial outbreak. In many places, population levels did not recover to pre-plague numbers for over 150 years. The scale of death during the Black Death is almost incomprehensible in modern terms. No war, no single natural disaster, and no previous epidemic in recorded European history had ever claimed so many lives in so short a time. This was not merely a tragedy measured in numbers. It was a collapse of human presence across an entire continent. The Black Death did not kill silently. It announced its presence through terrifying signs etched into the human body, transforming the sick into living symbols of impending death. In the medieval world, where medicine was primitive and explanations often relied on superstition, the sudden appearance of these symptoms struck fear into entire communities. Once the first signs showed, the victim's fate was often sealed. The plague manifested in multiple forms, each deadly in its own way. The bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic forms. Bubonic plague, the most common, gave the disease its chilling name. Victims developed painful, swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, which could grow as large as eggs or even apples. These swellings appeared most frequently in the armpits, neck, and groin, areas where lymph nodes are concentrated. The buboes were often black or deep purple, hard and hot to the touch, sometimes oozing pus and blood. Their grotesque appearance became the unmistakable mark of the plague. The disease began subtly. At first, victims might experience a mild fever, headache, or fatigue, symptoms that in any other time might have seemed harmless. But within hours, these signs intensified. Fever spiked, sometimes reaching 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by chills, nausea, and dizziness. Victims became disoriented, weak, and unable to perform daily tasks. In crowded medieval towns, where illness spread quickly and medical help was scarce, these early symptoms often went untreated, allowing the disease to progress rapidly. As infection took hold, the buboes emerged. Their sudden and painful swelling was often the first unmistakable sign that someone had been struck. Contemporary accounts describe the agony vividly. One Florentine observer wrote that the swellings grew in the groin or under the armpits, some as big as an egg, some as an apple, and from them thereafter sickness progressed to fever and vomiting and death. The appearance of these swellings caused panic, not only in the afflicted, but also in everyone around them. Families often abandoned sick relatives, fearing contagion. Neighbors shut their doors, priests hesitated to offer last rites, and entire households were quarantined by fear rather than law. Alongside buboes came a host of secondary symptoms. Victims frequently suffered from intense pain in the limbs, muscle cramps, and a burning sensation in the skin. Many developed dark blotches or spots, caused by subdermal bleeding, a sign of internal hemorrhaging. These blotches, sometimes referred to as God's tokens, were ominous indicators that death was near. Skin might turn black in patches, particularly on the extremities, giving rise to the term Black Death. To medieval eyes, it seemed as though the body itself was rotting while the victim still breathed. Vomiting and diarrhea often followed, weakening the body further. Breathing became labored, and coughing sometimes produced blood. Many victims suffered delirium and hallucinations, brought on by high fever and infection of the nervous system. People raved, screamed, or fell into stupors. Some wandered the streets in confusion before collapsing. Others lay motionless, unable to move or speak, their bodies consumed from within. The most terrifying form of the plague was pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs. This form could arise on its own or develop secondarily from bubonic infection. Unlike bubonic plague, which required flea bites for transmission, pneumonic plague spread directly from person to person through droplets in the air, coughs, sneezes, even breath. Victims developed sudden high fevers, chills, chest pain, and a violent cough producing bloody sputum. Their breath became foul and breathing excruciating. Death often came within 1 to 3 days, sometimes in less than 24 hours. Medieval doctors and priests who approached the sick to comfort or treat them frequently succumbed soon after. Then there was septicemic plague, the rarest but deadliest form. In these cases, the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymphatic system. Symptoms appeared rapidly: extreme fever, chills, abdominal pain, vomiting, and widespread internal bleeding. Victims developed dark purple patches on their skin as their blood vessels broke down, and gangrene could set on fingers, toes, and noses. Septicemic plague often killed before any visible buboes appeared, leaving people die suddenly without warning signs. Chroniclers described individuals dropping dead in streets or fields, with no time for prayers, confessions, or goodbyes. What made these symptoms so horrifying to contemporaries was their speed and inevitability. One day, a person could appear healthy. Within 48 hours, they could be dead. Families witnessed loved ones transform before their eyes. Faces flushed with fever, bodies swelling with grotesque lumps, skin darkening as if consumed by some invisible fire. In households where multiple members were infected, this transformation happened again and again, often wiping out entire families within a week. The medical understanding of the time was utterly inadequate to deal with such terrifying symptoms. Physicians relied on theories of imbalanced humors and miasma, believing disease came from corrupted air or planetary misalignments. Treatments included bloodletting, applying poultices to buboes, drinking herbal concoctions, or burning aromatic substances to clean the air. None of these treatments stopped the disease. In fact, some hastened death by weakening the patient further. Surgeons occasionally attempted to lance buboes, draining pus in the hope of removing the sickness, but this offered little relief and carried high risks of infection. The visual impact of plague symptoms on communities cannot be overstated. Buboes were impossible to hide. Those afflicted were immediately marked, often shunned, sometimes forcibly isolated. In many cities, authorities or fearful neighbors would lock infected families inside their homes, sealing doors with boards or nails, effectively turning houses into tombs. Street patrols watched for signs of sickness, and the sight of someone clutching at a swollen armpit or staggering with fever struck terror in everyone nearby. The symptoms also altered religious and cultural behavior. People saw the buboes and darkened skin as signs of divine wrath. Some joined flagellant movements, whipping themselves in public as penance for sins they believed had brought the plague. Others turned on minorities, accusing them of poisoning wells or spreading disease, pointing to physical symptoms as proof of unnatural causes. The grotesque appearance of the afflicted fed hysteria and scapegoating, deepening the social chaos. The soundscape of plague symptoms was as haunting as the sight. Cities echoed with coughing, moaning, and wailing, especially at night. Priests reciting last rites did so over rows of bodies, sometimes so quickly that names blurred into a litany of the doomed. Buboes burst, producing foul smells that filled homes and hospitals. These sensory realities left deep, psychological scars. Survivors carried with them memories of not only who they lost, but how they looked and sounded in their final days. As the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it brought not only death and disease, but also a tide of fear so intense that it tore the social fabric apart. Panic spread faster than the plague itself, infiltrating every layer of society, from bustling cities to quiet villages. People who had once lived side by side in relative harmony turned against one another, searching desperately for someone to blame for the inexplicable devastation consuming their world. In the medieval mind, the plague was not merely a natural disaster. It was a divine punishment, a malevolent curse, or a plot by hidden enemies. Because medical knowledge was limited and germ theory was centuries away, people sought explanations in the only frameworks they understood: religion, superstition, and scapegoating. As corpses filled the streets and bells tolled day and night, fear warped into something far more dangerous: collective hysteria. Across Europe, communities collapsed under the weight of panic. People fled their homes in terror, abandoning neighbors, friends, and even family members. Parents left sick children behind. Spouses deserted each other, and servants refused to care for their masters. Chroniclers of the time described cities where houses stood silent, with doors bolted shut and windows covered, while the infected died alone inside. The social bonds that had held communities together for centuries fractured almost overnight. In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, chaos reigned. Government structures were overwhelmed. Graveyards overflowed. Priests, doctors, and officials died alongside the poor, leaving towns leaderless and in disarray. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of poisoned wells, cursed winds, or secret cabals plotting to destroy Christendom. In the absence of answers, superstition flourished. Any unusual occurrence, any foreigner, or any marginalized group could be seen as the source of the plague. This atmosphere of terror set the stage for widespread persecution, particularly against Jewish communities, who had lived across Europe for centuries, often in separate quarters known as ghettos. Jews were already subject to deep-rooted anti-Semitic stereotypes and restrictions, making them easy targets for suspicion. As the death toll climbed, accusations emerged that Jews were deliberately poisoning wells, rivers, and food supplies to kill Christians. These accusations were often based on nothing more than fear and rumor, but in a world consumed by panic, they were enough to ignite violence. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in Switzerland, in the town of Chillon in 1348. Under torture, a Jewish man confessed to having poisoned the wells. His forced confession was used as evidence across the region, sparking a wave of massacres. In many cities, Jewish communities were rounded up, imprisoned, and burned alive in public squares. Chroniclers describe entire communities being wiped out in a single day, their homes looted and synagogues destroyed. The violence spread rapidly. In Basel, authorities constructed a wooden house on an island in the Rhine River, locked hundreds of Jews inside, and set it ablaze. In Strasbourg, before the plague even reached the city, panic and paranoia led officials to burn approximately 2,000 Jews in February 1349. Those who survived were often forcibly baptized, expelled, or stripped of property. Similar pogroms occurred across Germany, France, Spain, and beyond, following a grim pattern. Fear turned to rumor, rumor turned to accusation, and accusation turned to bloodshed. Panic was not limited to persecution of minorities. It also manifested in religious extremism. Groups known as flagellants emerged, roaming from town to town. These men believed that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and they sought to atone through public acts of self-punishment. Wearing simple robes, they marched in processions, singing hymns and chanting prayers. At each stop, they gathered crowds, then whipped themselves with barbed scourges until blood streamed down their backs. They believed that by suffering publicly, they could cleanse the world of sin and end the plague. At first, many communities welcomed the flagellants, hoping their extreme devotion would bring divine mercy. But soon, their fervor turned dangerous. They began to denounce clergy, claiming that the church had grown corrupt and failed to protect the people. In some towns, they attacked priests or demanded that officials join their processions. Their rituals, which could last 33 and a half days, symbolizing the years of Christ's life, became theatrical spectacles of fear, penance, and fanaticism. The flagellant movement spread across Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of Eastern Europe, leaving behind both awe and unease. In this fevered climate, outsiders of any kind became targets. Travelers, lepers, beggars, and foreigners were often accused of spreading the disease intentionally. Lepers, already ostracized due to their condition, were particularly vulnerable. Some were executed or expelled en masse, accused of carrying poison or curse powders. Even the sick themselves were sometimes persecuted. In some regions, homes of plague victims were burned to prevent contagion, with people still inside. Fear blurred the line between protection and cruelty. Panic also eroded trust in institutions. Many people blamed local authorities, believing they were hiding cures or working with foreigners to bring about disaster. When city governments attempted to impose quarantines, restrict travel, or regulate markets, citizens often rebelled violently. Food shortages, price inflation, and labor disruptions further inflamed tensions. Riots broke out in some cities, as starving people looted bakeries and warehouses. The social order teetered on the edge of collapse. The church, once the moral anchor of medieval Europe, also faced intense scrutiny. Many clergy died performing last rites or caring for the sick, but others fled, leaving parishes abandoned. As prayers and processions failed to stop the plague, faith wavered. Some people turned to heretical sects, mystics, or folk healers, while others grew resentful, believing God had abandoned them. The inability of the church to explain or halt the disaster shook the spiritual confidence of millions. Persecution during the Black Death was not only physical but psychological. Communities turned inward, erecting barriers of fear. Markets emptied, inns refused travelers. Doors were barred against anyone who was not a known neighbor. People eyed strangers with suspicion, seeing potential poisoners or carriers of death in every unfamiliar face. Even the act of sharing water or food could be viewed as dangerous. These reactions, though born of fear, had long-term consequences. Entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out or driven into exile, their property confiscated by local lords or townspeople. Trade networks were disrupted as travelers and merchants were attacked or expelled. Cultural exchange slowed, and cities became isolated islands of suspicion, each fearing the next. The psychological scars of persecution would last far beyond the plague years, influencing social relations, religious attitudes, and policies for generations. The Black Death did not simply bring death. It shattered the economic and social foundations of medieval Europe. What the plague left behind was not only silence and empty streets, but also a world where the old structures of power, labor, and wealth were suddenly destabilized. As millions died within a span of a few short years, the balance between lords and peasants, cities and countryside, production and consumption was thrown into chaos. What emerged was a period of profound upheaval that altered the trajectory of European society. Before the plague, Europe's population had grown significantly. Fields were cultivated to their limits. Towns were bustling with artisans and merchants, and feudal structures were firmly entrenched. Landowners depended on vast numbers of peasants and serfs to work the fields, providing food and resources for the kingdom. In cities, guilds controlled trades, markets thrived, and trade routes linked distant regions. But this complex system was fragile, held together by the sheer number of people who kept it functioning. When the Black Death struck, it wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, and the effects were immediate and devastating. Entire villages were depopulated. Fields lay untilled, crops rotted, and livestock wandered untended. In some places, so many shepherds died that flocks of sheep roamed freely, destroying crops and further reducing food supplies. Mills stood silent because there was no one to operate them. Roads that once bustled with traders became eerily empty. Harvest seasons passed with little to gather, creating shortages not because the land could not produce, but because there were too few hands left to work. The labor shortage became one of the most defining features of the post-plague world. With so many workers dead, those who survived suddenly found themselves in a position they had never experienced before. Their labor was valuable. Peasants and artisans could demand higher wages, and many did. Landlords and city authorities, accustomed to a stable and cheap labor force, were shocked to find that fields remained empty unless they agreed to pay more. In some regions, workers moved from manor to manor, seeking the best offers. This newfound mobility undermined the traditional feudal order, which had bound peasants to the land and to their lords through obligation rather than choice. Ruling elites reacted with resistance and repression. Determined to maintain their control and wealth, they passed strict laws to freeze wages and restrict movement. One of the most famous examples is the Ordinance of Laborers, issued in England in 1349. This decree attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels, making it illegal for workers to demand higher pay or for employers to offer it. It also sought to punish those who left their lords in search of better conditions. But despite these efforts, enforcement proved nearly impossible. With vast stretches of land going untended and cities desperate for labor, workers held real leverage, whether the elites liked it or not. As labor costs rose, so too did the cost of goods and services. Inflation swept through towns and markets. Food prices fluctuated wildly depending on the availability of workers and the health of the harvest. Artisans raised prices to reflect their scarcity, while merchants struggled to maintain supply chains disrupted by death and fear. Trade routes were weakened not only by the loss of life, but also by fear contagion. Ships were left in harbors, caravans halted, and fairs canceled. Economic activity slowed to a crawl in some regions, while in others, opportunistic traders made fortunes exploiting shortages. The landed aristocracy, who had once enjoyed steady incomes from rents and labor services, faced mounting losses. With so many peasants dead or demanding better terms, rents went unpaid, and manorial profits dwindled. Some nobles were forced to lease their lands under new, more flexible arrangements, granting peasants more freedom in exchange for the continuation of basic agricultural work. Others went bankrupt, unable to maintain their estates. In regions like England and France, some smaller lords sold off lands to wealthier neighbors or to prosperous peasants, slowly altering the landscape of land ownership. Urban centers experienced their own form of turmoil. Many skilled craftsmen died, leading to collapse of workshops and guild activities. Apprenticeships were disrupted, and trades that relied on the careful transmission of knowledge from master to apprentice were endangered. In some cities, survivors from outside were invited in to fill labor gaps, introducing new skills, languages, and tensions. Social hierarchies within cities began to shift. Wealthy merchants who survived often consolidated power, purchasing property left vacant by the dead and expanding their commercial influence. Meanwhile, women's roles underwent significant, if complex, changes. The labor shortage meant that women increasingly took on roles that had previously been dominated by men. They worked in fields, managed businesses, and in some cases inherited property from deceased husbands or relatives. In towns, widows ran shops and joined trades to keep their families afloat. Although many of these gains would later be rolled back as societies tried to restore normalcy, the immediate aftermath of the plague saw a brief opening of social roles that had been rigid for centuries. The upheaval also extended to religious institutions, which had been major economic players. Monasteries and convents lost huge numbers of monks and nuns. Some monasteries never recovered, closing their doors permanently. Those that remained found themselves short of labor to farm their lands or maintain their buildings. With clergy dying in vast numbers, the church's administrative and economic functions were weakened, leading to less effective management of estates and charitable activities. This further undermined the church's influence, not just spiritually but economically. In the countryside, the abandonment of land led to changes in how it was used. Some fields reverted to pasture because livestock required less labor than crops. Forests grew back on abandoned farmland, altering landscapes. Lords sometimes consolidated villages that had been partially depopulated, merging properties and reducing the number of active settlements. This reshaping of rural spaces reflected both economic necessity and demographic reality. Socially, the plague blurred the boundaries between classes in unexpected ways. With death striking both rich and poor, survivors found themselves in a world where inheritances shifted rapidly. Peasants could inherit land from deceased relatives, suddenly becoming landholders. Merchants could acquire noble properties at discounted prices. Nobles without heirs saw their estates divided or sold. Wealth and property flowed through society in new patterns, eroding some of the rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval life. In some places, new elites emerged, not by birth but by survival and opportunity. Yet, this new fluidity also bred tension. As peasants gained leverage and wages rose, elites grew resentful, seeing their traditional authority slipping away. Governments imposed taxes to fund war efforts and public expenses, often targeting the lower classes. This combination of economic strain and social change laid the groundwork for uprisings and revolts. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one such eruption, fueled in part by labor laws and economic pressure following the Black Death. Similar unrest occurred elsewhere in Europe, as people resisted attempts to return to pre-plague conditions. The psychological dimension of this upheaval was equally profound. People who survived the plague often did so surrounded by death, inheriting wealth not through enterprise but through the sudden disappearance of entire families. Streets once filled with life were lined with empty homes, abandoned shops, and overgrown gardens. Survivors navigated a world where old social certainties no longer applied. Some became opportunists, amassing wealth and power. Others withdrew into isolation, haunted by loss. Markets, manors, guilds, and churches, these were the pillars of medieval society. The Black Death shook each of them, not with a single blow, but with a relentless, invisible force that decimated their human foundations. Labor, land, wealth, and social hierarchy were all thrown into motion at once, creating ripples that would shape the coming centuries. The Black Death was not only a biological catastrophe, it was a psychological earthquake that reshaped the mental and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. It left deep scars in the minds of those who survived, altering how they saw death, faith, society, and even themselves. The trauma of witnessing entire communities vanish, of living daily in the shadow of sudden and brutal death, seeped into every corner of medieval culture, into art, religion, literature, rituals, and collective memory. For those who lived through it, death was no longer distant or predictable. It was immediate, unpredictable, and horrifying. People could wake one morning feeling healthy and be dead within days, sometimes even hours. Families vanished overnight. Streets that had once been filled with the sounds of merchants and laughter became silent, except for the tolling of funeral bells and the creak of death carts. In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, the smell of decay hung in the air, mingling with incense and smoke from burning bodies. This omnipresence of death transformed the psychology of an entire generation. Medieval Europeans had always lived with a strong awareness of mortality, but the Black Death magnified this awareness into obsession. One of the most striking cultural manifestations of this shift was the rise of the memento mori theme, Latin for remember that you must die. Art, literature, and sermons began to emphasize the fragility of human life and the certainty of death more intensely than ever before. Skulls, skeletons, and decaying corpses became common motifs in paintings, carvings, and manuscripts. Church murals depicted the dance of death, danse macabre, where skeletal figures led kings, peasants, merchants, and clergy alike to grave, symbolizing that no one could escape death's grasp. In illuminated manuscripts, marginal illustrations showed corpses crawling from graves, worms eating flesh, and skeletal hands reaching out from the earth. These images were not mere decoration. They reflect a society that had internalized death as a constant presence, something that could not be ignored or sanitized. The dance of death became a popular cultural symbol throughout Europe, reminding people that death united all classes and spared no one. Religion, the central pillar of medieval life, also underwent a profound psychological shift. The church had always provided explanations for suffering, framing plagues and disasters as divine punishments meant to inspire repentance. But the scale and ferocity of the Black Death challenged these narratives. People prayed, fasted, and joined processions, but the plague did not stop. Priests died alongside lay people, monasteries emptied, and holy relics failed to protect believers. For many, this shook their faith in traditional religious structures. Some responded by becoming more devout, turning to personal piety, mysticism, and private forms of worship. Others joined radical religious movements, such as the Flagellants, who believe extreme penance would appease God's wrath. But for others, disillusionment set in. If priests could die as easily as sinners, if relics held no power, and if God allowed the righteous to perish alongside the wicked, then the certainties that had guided medieval religious life began to unravel. This erosion of unquestioning faith laid subtle foundations for future religious questioning and reform movements. The plague also transformed attitudes toward the body and the afterlife. With so many dying so quickly, burial rituals were simplified or abandoned altogether. Mass graves replaced individual burials, and there was little time for the elaborate funerals that had once been central to medieval religious practice. People feared that improper burial could endanger the soul, but in many places, the sheer number of corpses made proper rites impossible. This caused widespread spiritual anxiety, as survivors worried about their loved one's salvation and their own fate should they die unshriven or unburied. Psychologically, survivors carried immense trauma. Chroniclers wrote of people wandering aimlessly through towns, numb from loss, unable to process the scale of death around them. In some cases, this trauma manifested as religious fanaticism, with individuals joining extreme sects or embracing apocalyptic visions. In others, it produced fatalism and nihilism. Some medieval texts describe people who, convinced of their impending death, abandoned morality altogether, indulging in feasting, drinking, and pleasures, reasoning that if death was inevitable, there was no reason for restraint. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his famous work The Decameron, described Florentines who isolated themselves in luxurious villas to eat, drink, and tell stories, trying to shut out the horrors unfolding outside. Art and literature became both a reflection and an outlet for these shifting attitudes. Writers chronicled the plague with a mixture of horror, awe, and resignation. Boccaccio's Decameron depicted not only the suffering, but also the psychological escapism of those trying to survive. In England, William Langland's Piers Plowman touched on themes of corruption and divine punishment. Mystical visions, such as those of St. Bridget of Sweden or Catherine of Siena, were filled with imagery of divine wrath, suffering, and redemption. The cultural mood became darker, more introspective, preoccupied with sin, mortality, and the fleeting nature of earthly life. Visual art mirrored these emotions. Skeletons and emaciated figures appeared not just in churches, but in civic art, reflecting the shared experience of death across all classes. Tombs of the wealthy began to feature transi-effigies, carved representations of the deceased not as idealized noble figures, but as rotting corpses, sometimes with worms eating into their flesh. These macabre tombs were not meant to horrify for horror's sake. They were spiritual reminders of mortality and the vanity of earthly power. The psychological toll extended to family structures and personal identity. In many cases, survivors were the last members of their families, inheriting homes and belongings but living surrounded by empty spaces and fading memories. Children grew up without parents, sometimes adopted into new households, sometimes left to fend for themselves. Communities were fragmented. Familiar faces disappeared, replaced by strangers or left unfilled. This sense of dislocation reshaped how people saw themselves, not just as individuals within stable communities, but as survivors in a world that had been brutally and irreversibly changed. Collective memory of the Black Death was preserved in chronicles, folk songs, religious texts, and oral traditions passed down through generations. It became a shared point of reference, a dark marker in time. People spoke of life before the plague and after the plague, as if a line had been carved through history itself. Superstitions evolved, linking certain smells, winds, or astrological signs with death. Festivals and rituals changed, sometimes taking on darker tones, sometimes seeking to drive away death through celebration and excess. Even centuries later, the psychological reverberations persisted. Communities rebuilt, but the memory of mass death lingered in architecture, in graveyards, in paintings, in prayers. Survivors' children inherited not only property but stories of fear and loss, shaping how future generations approached sickness, faith, and society. The cultural imagination of Europe had been permanently altered. Death was no longer just a spiritual transition. It was a visible, daily reality that had invaded homes, churches, and marketplaces alike. The Black Death also introduced a new scale of existential questioning. People asked why such a catastrophe had happened, why the innocent died, and whether the world was nearing its end. Millenarian beliefs flourished, with some interpreting the plague as a sign of the apocalypse foretold in the Book of Revelation. Artists and writers grapple with themes of divine justice and human helplessness, producing works that still resonate with their raw emotional power centuries later.